Okay, evening all. Okay, welcome to the King's Crusher radio show. Okay, I thought it would be interesting this week to have a look at the encounters between Kasparov and Carlsen, which occurred at the Reykjavik Rapid tournament, which was a knockout tournament. And so Magnus Carlsen was just 13 years old, an international master though at 13, with a FIDE rating apparently of 2584, and so he was playing Kasparov, who was ranked 1 in the world, 2831 at the time. So 2004. I want to check the board's okay for everyone. Let's carry on. Okay, so there were two games. In the first game, Kasparov was white against Magnus, and he kicked off with the English opening. He played c4, and Magnus responded with knight f6. Okay, and we saw knight c3, so white's increasing the influence over d5 square. And here Magnus decides to go for a fianchetto with g6, and we get a transposition now into a King's Indian defense. After e4, black plays d6 to discourage e5 from white, and now d4, it's a transposition into the King's Indian defense. After knight f3 castles bishop e2, it looks like mainline King's Indian classical so far. But after e5, instead of the most common move, which is castling, white plays bishop e3, just inviting a couple of different lines. One is the knight coming to g4, and there's a kind of dance with that. But there's this other move which is played by Magnus, which puts some dynamism into the position, some pressure on e4. Black plays e takes d4 here. So structurally, after knight takes d4, we see that, okay, black's got the semi-open file pressure, and white's still got a good grip over d5, and white's task maybe is to make d6 comfortable if black ever plays c6. But is black going to sort of compensate for this d file pressure with the e file? Okay, he plays c6. Okay, and now white reinforces e4 ahead of time with f3 instead of just castling. Black plays rook e8, and you see this bishop slightly loose here, so it looks as though this position is prone to d5s potentially from black, to black playing d5 to try and expose this kind of loose bishop on e3. And instead of castling routinely, Kasparov plays a prophylaxis type move, bishop f2, just getting out of the way potentially of d5. At least the bishop's not too vulnerable. And immediately Magnus does play d5 anyway. So the time limit for this, by the way, just to emphasize again, it's a rapid time control, 25 minutes each, with a 5-second increment. I believe that was the exact time control. Okay, so d5 liberates black's position a bit, and white now decides to create a pawn majority on the queen side by playing e takes d5, and now after c takes d5, playing c5. So this is, for those of you just joining, sorry, this is Garry Kasparov against Magnus Carlsen in the Reykjavik Rapid Play of 2004. It was a knockout format. So Kasparov here has a 3-2 pawn majority, but black has, you know, good active pieces. All of these pieces are quite active at the moment. Knight c6 is played, and now after castles, Magnus goes in for some dark square counterplay with the move knight h5. So he's introducing some ideas, some pressure here, and also potentially even the e5 square. h2 could be potentially vulnerable. And in fact, this resource is made use of now after Queen D2, Bishop E5, provoking a weakness now on White's king side. If H3 is played, it looks a little bit unpleasant to play H3, weakening dark squares even more. So G3 looks logical, blunting the bishop on E5. Okay. Bishop H3 is played. And after Rook Fe1, let's get a positional evaluation from everyone. If I give you 20 seconds to check out this position, who do you think's better, white or black? And why? Okay, a couple of you said black, more pieces in the centre, attacking. Frank Gammett says, I like F4, okay. Anyone else? Anyone else? Alright, so it looks like a complex position. You know, in the long term there's a 3-2 pawn majority, there's a blockade on D4. Black does seem to have dynamic pressure. The D pawn potentially is a vulnerability though as well on that D file, isn't it? Okay. Well, it's an interesting position. Magnus now retreats his knight to G7. And with this, you know, he's introducing some ideas, potentially, like knight F5, putting more pressure on D4. Or knight E6 maybe. Okay. Or even the knight's now unblocked the pawn. Maybe H5, H4 is possible to try and undermine the dark squares a bit more. Rook AD1 reinforcing D4, and of course now with this, you know, D5 looks vulnerable to say knight B5, but D5 will be under fire. And in fact, this is used, this resource, Rook C8, knight DB5, hitting the D5 pawn, which seems quite vulnerable. But okay, you might think, well, the knight can be kicked. After A6, Kasparov temporarily sacrifices a pawn. He's going to win D5. He plays knight D6, forking both rooks and basically asking Magnus to relinquish the dark square bishop. And with this dark square bishop loss, if the bishop has to take on D6, we see that these dark squares are going to be a little weaker now. But what else? Black doesn't want to lose the exchange here, so he does take on D6. Okay, so C takes. And now, okay, Magnus doesn't just routinely take on D6, which looks quite unpleasant in any case. He plays D4, at least trying to blunt the D file pressure. White is not obliged to take on D4. He can actually just move the knight, and he does, protecting the pawn. And it looks as though, well, is White going to play bishop D4 and come on to F6 now? But Magnus's idea is to play bishop F5 to get rid of that knight. And if he gets the chance, you know, if he takes, then takes here, he might potentially be okay. But there's a really, really strong move which Kasparov plays here. If I give you 20 seconds, by the way, if you want to play chess, please go to the openings book away from the move score of the game. So 20 seconds, can you see what White played in this position? Black is on the brink of just taking on E4 and taking on D6. So what is a good move to play here for White? 20 seconds starting from now. Okay, anyone? Alright, okay, a couple of you have found a really good move, I think. D7, forking both rooks again now, like the knight did earlier. Now if queen takes d7, that would be a total disaster. Knight f6 check, just forking queen and king. So basically forcing bishop takes d7, giving white the chance to play the very uncomfortable move bishop takes d4 now. So these dark squares are really being exploited. Knight f6 looks like a huge tactical threat. Okay, Magnus tries to relieve some pressure by taking on d4. After queen takes d4, he's still faced with this knight f6, and also his bishop is now vulnerable. In this position, it looks like very bad news here. In fact, Magnus looks busted already at move 24. He tries knight f5 and giving up the bishop. Okay, check. There isn't too much compensation here, so it has been a bit of a disaster. Rook ed8. Okay, a few token moves are played, taking on d1. Queen takes d1, queen takes b1. All Kasparov needs to do is just consolidate. Queen b1. He takes the queens off, protects the a pawn. After knight d4, there is this remaining threat now of knight f3 and rook h2. It is a rapid game, but just rook e3 now, just defending f3, and white is just winning. It's just a piece up. There isn't any compensation here. Here Magnus did resign. Okay, remember it was just a rapid chess game, and Magnus was only 13 years old, so he didn't seem to put up much of a fight in this game. Admittedly, but you know, such a young player, he is an international master playing the world #1. Let's have a look at the game again, just to see the key points of interest again. So it started off with an English opening. So going into a King's Indian by transposition, and we see this very powerful move, bishop e3, which is a very good alternative to castling. And there's a theoretical line with knight g4, which is very popular. E takes d4, releases the tension in the center. But black's idea is to liberate like quickly with c6, and later, you know, pressure on the e file for d5. Okay, c6. So we see some strong prophylaxis moves in advance here from Kasparov. f3 supporting e4, and then this bishop retreat, getting out of the way of d5 to be able to answer it with, you know, taking and getting a 3-2 pawn majority. So this is what happens now. After d5, white takes this pawn and creates a very good blockade in the process as well on d4 against this d5 pawn. So there's a couple of strategic plans. Exploit the 3-2 pawn majority, or just put frontal pressure on that d5 pawn, ready for a knight b5 to try and just basically take it later. Knight c6, black trying to drum up some counterplay. Knight h5, but white has a strong grip on the position here, and he's just following his plan. Intensify the pressure on the d5 pawn, making use of that d file. Bishop e5, just calmly g3 is played. Okay, inviting positively bishop h3, but it's harmless, relatively harmless, one would think. After rook fe1, the knight went back, but white is just preparing more and more pressure now against the d5 pawn. Yes, it looks as though the d5 liberation from black, the whole plan seems to have been kind of almost refuted here. If black hasn't got enough counterplay in this position, then black is faced with this daunting, you know, prospect of just losing the d5 pawn for virtually nothing. Okay, so we see after rook c8, knight b5, big problems. Now say black had tried something else. What about you say a6? Let's try a6 to prevent knight b5. Is there any suggestions here that you might think? One problem, you know, maybe just knight b3, but what do you guys think? If I give you 20 seconds here, what would you do as white? I would imagine knight b3 is quite a good move, just increasing the pressure on d5. Okay, so that didn't happen. So in the game we saw rook c8, Magnus just inviting positively knight db5, and it looks a big problem. You know, if d4 here, then knight e4, and then two knights are ganging up on d6 to win the exchange. So that looks very unpleasant. So okay, in the game we saw a6. With black losing the dark square bishop, you know, his weaknesses around the king are much more evident, and d5 is still weak. So this combination of weaknesses is not very good at all to have after knight e4, but it was tactics which really celebrates these trump cards now. After bishop f5, this very strong tactical move is played. Otherwise black might have been able to see a much better game than the game continuation. If white doesn't have d7, then you know, there might be some counterplay, but d7 is a really powerful move, forcing the bishop to swallow its pride and move again backwards, something it didn't want to do, leaving the white knight alone, very strong on e4 here, just pointing at f6 and these dark square weaknesses. So bishop takes d4, and it seems very difficult to try and defend f6 in this position. Also, there's an immediate threat of bishop takes g7 and queen takes d7 in any case. You can imagine rook e6, just bishop takes g7 will do here, for queen takes d7. So it looks fairly hopeless, this position. So knight takes d4, queen takes d4. So you might think, well, couldn't, you know, if the bishop moves here, then we just see knight f6 check, and that's absolutely all over. Just winning the exchange is enough. So okay, so we saw this piece sacrifice being used, which is just desperate really. It doesn't really do much. So after rook e8, just queen a4. The rooks exchange off, queen takes b2. Okay, picks up a pawn there, but queen b1 is a good consolidating move, protecting a2. And now he just takes off the queens, protects the a pawn and protects the f pawn, and that's it. It's only a rapid game, not to be analysed really too deeply. I think the encounter is classic though, the actual encounter. I think Kasparov had been paid a lot of money to play in this knockout tournament. There was a risk of having to play Magnus Carlsen and maybe, you know, risk great humiliation, you know, because Magnus was only 13 years old and you know, Kasparov playing in the event, he hadn't played that much prior to the event that year. Okay, but let's have a look at their second game, because each player were playing each other twice. So let's go on to the second game. Okay, so still Reykjavik 2004. Just load the game for that. Okay, So in the second game, Magnus gets to play with the white pieces against Kasparov. There's video footage actually on YouTube. Kasparov is a bit late for this game. It's an excellent funny video where Magnus is shown as preparing by looking at cartoon strips. Okay, Magnus kicks off with d4. So d5 from Kasparov. After c4 we see the rock solid Slav defense. Knight f3, knight f6. We see semi-Slav defense, the bishop being hemmed in. So this semi-Slav rock solid triangle. So the system Magnus chooses here is bishop g5. After knight bd7, just e3. Simple setup for white, it seems, on the surface anyway. But we get a kind of coiled spring type strategy now from black. Kasparov plays queen a5. So, you know, potentially there's this kind of coiled spring effect on g5, you know, with knight e4, you know, hitting g5. Have to be careful about this. Knight d2 looks like a great move against this kind of stuff, but it is leaving for a moment the bishop a bit looser. But on d takes there is the option, of course, of just bishop takes f6, getting out of the way of the queen. If we look at it, this wasn't played, but if you know d takes c4, you could just take here and then take on c4, maybe, possibly. But okay, Kasparov plays bishop b4 here, and we see queen c2. So white's got very good control over e4. Black castles, bishop e2. Now e5 from Kasparov, energetic reaction in the center. And Magnus doesn't mind just castling here, letting black play e takes d4. But no structural damage is to be inflicted on white because of this move, knight b3. Instead of just taking, which might leave him with an isolated pawn, white with the isolated queen's pawn, no, knight b3, hitting the queen, being able to recapture that with the knight if needed, if he wants. But maybe the isolated queen's pawn is no big deal. In fact, after queen b6, e takes d4 is played. Okay, so we have an isolated queen's pawn situation emerging now after d takes c4, bishop takes c4. But is black in the position to really exploit this? White has very nice pieces here. The knights are quite good. The bishop and queen, I don't know, look a bit awkward. This hemmed in bishop here. What do you think of this position if you were to evaluate it? If I give you 20 seconds here, who do you prefer in this position? White or black? Okay, one of you prefers white. Okay, I think white's pieces look good. He's just got that isolated queen's pawn structurally to be concerned about. Black has to be concerned about this hemmed in bishop, but okay. Alright, it's a complex position. a5 is played. a4. Now queen goes back, and you know, maybe a battery is going to be set up on h2. That's the intention here. Simple. And then maybe, you know, also knight b6 is going to be handy. Rook a e1. But there is this unpleasant idea. Maybe, you know, d5 is handy for white at some point. But Magnus is in no rush. He doesn't have to rush for anything at the moment. After h6. He drops the bishop back actually, and now the bishop can come and harass the queen potentially, or at least exchange off the dark square bishops. Bishop d6. Now interestingly, bishop g3 wasn't played in this position, which you might think is strategically useful to get rid of the dark squared bishops. No, the bishop is actually maintained on h4 to provide a constant threat of bishop takes f6. If it's maintained here, then knight b6 is always bishop f6, so this bishop's still hemmed in. So Magnus just plays h3. So the knight, you know, will potentially, there's a bishop f6, but this bishop would be attacked. Okay, but actually this is what happens in any case. Knight b6 is played in this position, attacking the bishop. But bishop f6, knight takes c4. Now in this position, it starts getting a bit hairy. White plays now knight e4, so he's introducing queen takes c4 now. And if g takes, then you know maybe knight takes f6 is very good there. And if king g7, well, I think there's knight h5 check, and then you can take on here, or even stronger. But okay, so Kasparov in this position is under a bit of an he's in an uncomfortable position actually, it would seem. He plays bishop h2 check with the idea of dropping back now the knight. Now this looks like this next move looks quite brave actually from white. Can you guess what white plays in this position? If I give you 20 seconds starting from now. Okay. Alright, well in the game the quite scary looking move to play is king takes h2, but that's what was played, allowing this kind of invitation for a discovered check in various ways, but it's harmless. This check, the bishop interposes now, attacking the queen. Kasparov is forced to go into an seemingly embarrassing pin with knight d6. It looks awkward. It looks as though white's definitely got something in this position. He's got c file pressure, he's got d5, he's got this pin. He can put more pressure on immediately with queen c5, which he does, queen c5. Okay, Kasparov is forced into defending meekly with rook d8. And now more pressure, d5. Unpleasant. Okay, queen d7 now is played. Queen d7. Just unpinning the knight so that the knight is free to move to maybe f5. This is what happens. Knight d4, but it's going to be a pawn sacrifice. After knight f5, black is sacrificing a pawn to get out to solve the problems tactically. So a pawn up now for Magnus after takes. Knight takes c6. But this position has opposite coloured bishops, so it might be tricky. Rook e8. Okay. It looks as though white should be better. He just plays a natural looking, well, he is a pawn up. He just plays rook d1. After queen e6, rook fe1. Kasparov must have been quite worried here at the prospect of losing to his 13-year-old opponent, an international master. at the time, Magnus Carlsen. He must have been slightly worried, because if you look at white's position, it does look very, very strong still. But okay, bishop b7, and it looks as though black's going to have a very nice pin soon. But Magnus gets out of the way, knight d4, attacking the queen, inviting an exchange of knights. But we're going into this opposite colour bishop scenario a little bit more with simplification. Knight takes d4, and here the move queen takes d4 is played. Possibly this needs analysis. This position, there might be more than one possibility, either taking here or queen g6, just hitting g2. But this isn't gone into. Queen takes d4 is played. In this position, queen g6, threatening mate. Okay. Now there's a couple of ways to parry this. At least you might consider bishop g3, but Magnus's move offers the exchange of queens. He plays queen g4, okay, defending g2. So we have this. We're coming into this two rooks and versus bishop ending, opposite colour bishops. Okay, so I mean, maybe some of you would have preferred in this position, if you had this position, would many of you have preferred bishop g3? Perhaps it could be considered, but it looks as though this bishop's very nice on the diagonal now, and also there might be annoying moves to consider all the time. Like queen c2. Okay, so Magnus he simplifies by getting the queens off. Okay, Kasparov accepts that. Okay, going into this ending, where also, if you look at this bishop, there is a target, this a5 pawn. If that a5 drops, then white's got, you know, 2-0 pawn majority. Bishop c6 attacking white's a4 pawn, b3. After f6 we see bishop c3, so tying the rook down for a moment. So is black getting dangerously close to losing this ending? Kasparov doesn't mind exchanging off a pair of rooks here. So he takes on e1 and plays bishop d5. White's two pawns are of course vulnerable on the light squares with no bishop to defend them. Rook b1. Now the king comes in, king f7, and the white king comes in. Okay. Rook b8, not minding of course losing a5 and exchanging rooks. This opposite coloured bishop and pawn ending would seem quite easy to draw potentially. So, but bishop a5 is not played. Actually, b4 is played, keeping the a pawn mobile if black's going to take. Black does take, but still, if a light square blockade can be set up, you can't imagine it to be very easy to win this at all. Bishop takes b4, bishop c4. The light square blockade against the outside pass pawn is set up comfortably here. Okay, f3, king g6, king f4, h5. Getting some pawns off could help black to try and draw. Okay, check. Not minding actually undoubling white's pawns. Bishop c5. So can this bishop keep hold of the pawn and the rook do something? That's interesting. But no, black goes for important counterplay now on g2. Kasparov plays actually rook b2, and after king g3, just goes behind the pawn like this, rook a2. So keeping an eye on g2 and the pawn. White protects. It looks drawn now, king f7. After rook c1. The problem is the rook is kind of protecting f1 against bishop f1s, so it can't venture too much out without laying this bishop f1. g5 restricting the king, you know, these squares. Check. Okay, but now it is decided to play rook c6, inviting bishop f1. Okay, looks dangerous, but bishop f2 offering here, and actually in this position after bishop f2, actually a draw was agreed. So let's have a look at what could have happened here. Why was a draw agreed here? Well, let's imagine in this position, so it was a major achievement, of course, for Magnus, only 13 years old, to draw Kasparov. He's only 2.484 at this time. Kasparov is 2.831, but it's rapid chess. It's 25 minutes, 5-second increment. So okay, maybe that can be that can be factored in as well. So, but in this position, okay, let's carry on. If rook takes a5, maybe a dangerous move is you might consider is bishop d4. But of course, okay, if bishop d4, you know, maybe there's a couple of options. A simple one might be rook f5, where it looks awkward. Alternatively, even rook a2. What would you prefer here? Rook a2 or rook f5 in this position? What would you do here? Counterattack on g2 or protect f6? If I gave you 20 seconds starting from now. Thanks. The third possibility is the easy rook a6. Alright, forget that, scrap that. Rook a6, I thought the bishop. That's very nifty. 10 points for you, Kilotta. Sorry, rook a6 is also that would be dead draw, forget it. Yeah. So there we have it. So Kasparov was given a good run for his money in this other encounter. Although he walked over Magnus in the first game, this was a much more difficult game where he seemed to be in trouble. But let's have a look at it again, and maybe, you know, we can see even some better opportunities that White might have used in this game. He seemed to have a very good position from the opening. So d4, we saw a Slav defense going to a kind of Queen's Gambit declines Cambridge Springs transposition. So e3, Queen a5. The knight dropped back here. This knight after d2. So we saw Queen c2. Okay, Bishop e2, and now Black playing this central break e5. White castled. He's always got the queen as a target here for knight b3s, to, you know, to have the option of well, the knight's pretty good, it's out of the way. So e takes d4, knight b3, queen's kicked, e takes d4. So Magnus accepting the isolated queen's pawn here. The knight's protecting d4, of course, from the queen. So after d takes, bishop takes c4. I wonder if a5 was totally necessary. What was the major point of a5? If Black had played something else, would there be, you know, huge problems? Say Black had played bishop d6, right? Just say, out of interest, Black plays bishop d6. Is there a very strong move for white here? Or was this playable, do you think? If I give you 20 seconds here. White seems to have a nice position, but can he actually do anything here? Anyone? No, maybe there isn't anything obvious. Okay, in the game, A5 was played. So maybe potentially victimizing this knight, pushing it back, and setting up potentially a nice blockade, or even A3 to follow up. So A4 just put a lock and key on that. Queen C7. Now in this position, you might think there's some tactics here, actually, and I should have really engine checked this forensically, but there seems to be at least one tactical move available for white, but maybe it doesn't do anything, like knight B5. You know, if C takes, bishop takes F7, but I guess, you know, the queen could just, you know, do anything. I suppose go back to B8. Or back to B8 would be okay, and then what? Nothing. There's no follow-up. Is there? No. Okay, so black seems solid enough. So rook A E1. After H6 we saw bishop H4. Okay, so bishop D6. And we saw H3 from Magnus, which is kind of a mature move. So if bishop G3, maybe black does take and set up a blockade on D5. He's got a nice blockade potentially on D5. I don't think D5 from white works here, does it? Because CD, and we've got congestion on the C file. So okay, so H3 seems good. It keeps the pressure on black. Kasparov goes for that position with knight B6 anyway, knight B6. So it gets very tactical here. So it got very tactical. Bishop takes F6, knight takes C4. And this bishop didn't humbly retreat back, it just knight E4 hitting the knight and trying to win potentially black's dark square bishop. So this check was important perhaps. If black just plays knight B6, then I suppose knight takes D6 is looking nasty. Maybe bishop E5 here. This looks like a bigger advantage than the game, this position. You can imagine in this position that maybe well, the C5 square is good, maybe even a rook left is dangerous. So Kasparov's move in this position to play bishop H2 check, getting out of the way, keeping the bishop on, winning a move there. Knight D6 is interesting. So what would Magnus played king takes H2, which looks like a good move. If he played, say, bishop E5, let's say if you played bishop E5, we could just take on here, we could take on here, and I don't know, a blockade looks okay, potentially. We get a nice blockade on D5. That should be okay for black, shouldn't it? So this was interesting. King takes H2. So white has a lot of pressure here, and this awkward pin, it's amazing, you know, to see, you know, black kind of yeah, in trouble, it seems. So queen c5 defending, but you know, energetic Kasparov, he finds a way to solve the problems by sacrificing a pawn and heading for the opposite coloured bishop scenario. So he plays queen d7 with the idea of a pawn sack now after knight d4, knight f5. Okay, so we see this pawn sack, and we start to drift with opposite coloured bishops into an ending very difficult for white to try and realistically win. So queen g6, okay, with the queen still on, but now not for much longer. So Kasparov able to draw this soon, exchanges off a pair of rooks, and he's got a light square blockade. He's able to set up a light square blockade and maintain some counterplay as well on g2. Interesting was this h5 actually here, undoubling white's pawns. If he doesn't play h5, if black didn't play h5, would black be in trouble? So say black played, well, it's just allowing potentially, you know, it's allowing the king maybe to come across. Quick look at 15 d5. Okay, hold on a sec, we'll just go through this again, just one sec. So h5, g takes, king takes, means actually the king's quite aggressive potentially. If the king ventures over here, then this king could try and get g2. So okay, check, bishop c5. So black's able to get counterplay now on g2. So it was well worth doing, it seems, h5. So he's got sufficient counterplay in this continuation. Okay, so they agree to draw here, round about here. So quick look at 15 d5. 15 d5. Okay, so in the game rook e1 was played. So Steam UK. So d5 is the rook e1. I think just c takes d because there's a, you know, pin here. You know, you're going to just lose a piece, aren't you? Did anyone run this game through a computer to see any technical amazingness that white missed? Has anyone, if anyone wants to run quickly through an engine, otherwise, anyway, so it was just, this is just a brief overview really of these two rapid games, which I guess, have most of you seen these two before, these two games? I hope they were interesting, and we seem to have used up the best part of an hour actually just going over these two rapid games. So it was a classic encounter, and who knows, you know, maybe Magnus is going to be the next world champion. Maybe next year he wins this all play all tournament, which FIDE have organised. So it will be even more important, this encounter that they had. Of course, Kasparov became Magnus's coach for a while in recent times. But anyway, so I hope you enjoyed having a quick check of these two games, and maybe you didn't see them before, but I'll put them on the YouTube channel, So maybe you can carry on any questions there. So I thought it was interesting to have a look at them. Okay. So comments or questions on YouTube when I upload there, or maybe next week. Okay. Thanks very much. See you all next week then. Thanks very much.